Hello, everyone. Thanks for participating in this conversation called What Are the Effects of Social Controversy on the Communication of Basic Science? You can probably tell from the title that we're going to be talking about public engagement activities in this session that explicitly focus on the societal and ethical dimensions of issues section of science and society. My name is David Sittenfeld, and I manage the Forums and National Collaborations Department at the Museum of Science in Boston. And much of the work I do is focused upon promoting multi-directional learning between and among researchers and diverse publics to hopefully help inform the trajectory of emerging technologies and societal issues. So I've already been learning so much from the great ideas that you've been sharing in the plenaries and the smaller discussions thus far. And we're really fortunate to have three fantastic panelists who represent a fantastic range of socio-scientific research areas that have participated in and advocated for the kind of authentic public engagement that we've been hearing about in those earlier sessions. In just a moment, we're going to get a chance to hear from them in their own words, but I just wanted to say a couple things to frame our conversation. And I wanted to start that in service of doing good science communication ourselves, we met as a panel last week to think together about our goals for this discussion. And we talked a lot about the importance of focusing on very specific socio-scientific questions and topics so that when we can get people to come together and think about these things, publics can really learn about and engage with the specifics and the context of a specific challenge facing a community or an idea that a researcher may be formulating in their minds. And it's just one timely example. I'm sure many of you saw the article in Nature this morning describing the effectiveness of gene-drive mosquitoes in Italy in Nature Communications. And as part of a national NSF-funded project called Building with Biology, that was a partnership with AAAS and synthetic biologists across the country, I was part of a group that facilitated dialogues at about 60 science centers across the United States about the question of whether and how engineered mosquitoes should be released and whether or not they should incorporate gene drives. And in these kinds of engagements on that topic and others, I found it really powerful to have the opportunity to observe and listen to everyday community members as they're given the charge of helping to shape the future for these kinds of emerging technologies or societal issues. And I just want to say that if we give them the space and the environment and we trust them with the task, I've found that they can have the kind of thoughtful, informed, and respectful discourse that we know is so needed at this time. And I think all of us can learn from the ideas these people can generate. I'm also really inspired to say that I've encountered so many scientists who are excited to listen to and sort of incorporate the idea from these kind of public voices and think of what public perspectives mean for the future of their work. So we have a lot of work to do on this, but I think there's reason to be optimistic. And one reason is the amazing people you're going to be hearing from now. I'm going to ask our panelists to each give you a quick sort of introduction to their field of research and how it brings forward societal questions, and then we'll dive deeper into all of that. I know it's no small feat in just a couple of minutes to sort of introduce your field and how it brings forth societal questions, but I'm going to ask you to try. And we'll start with Megan Hofstrasser from the Innovative Genomics Institute at UC Berkeley, who works in the realm of emerging biotechnologies.
All right, thanks, David. Thanks for moderating this panel. Thanks for having me, everybody. So my name is Megan Hofstrasser. I work at a group called the Innovative Genomics Institute, or IGI, which is a partnership between UC Berkeley and UC San Francisco. And our whole focus is on CRISPR technologies and genetic engineering. So this includes genome editing, things like gene drives that David just mentioned, all sorts of applications that all revolve around being able to control the genome and change DNA in different ways. So I think it's probably not too hard to imagine how this leads to a lot of ethical and societal questions for us. I think the field as a whole has been very cognizant of this, in part because Jennifer Doudna, who founded our institute, I think has been very vocal about the need to engage the public on these topics and the need for people to understand what's going on and have a voice. So I think, you're probably familiar with some of these topics, but some of the things that we think about that are potentially controversial or at least in need of societal input include things like altering the human germline, so making heritable changes to people either by editing embryos or sperm or eggs eventually will probably be possible. Whether or not that's some form of enhancement is another question. That's something we talk about a lot. is that something we want people to be able to control for their children? Do we want people to pick traits for their kids, things like that? We also do a lot of agricultural engineering here at the IGI. And so we definitely are affected by the legacy of GMOs and the debate that happens around them, some of that controversy. And so it's been kind of interesting to see how people do or do not apply what they think about GMOs to newer technologies like gene editing from a technological perspective. But I would say, just as a comment, I think people do definitely apply what they think of GMOs to gene editing, but it also represents kind of a new chance to talk about things in a bit of a different way and actually consult people earlier on in the process, so that people don't feel as upset as they did about GMOs in general. So those are the types of questions that we think about and talk about. There's many more. I mean, gene editing you can do so many different things. So I would just say that the emphasis that we usually try to put on things is that none of these things are right or wrong. They're all up to us to decide. And we need to talk together about how we want to use these powerful technologies as human beings and come to, kind of mutual decisions, trying to keep in mind, which I think we'll talk about later, probably, equity in access to the technologies as well. So maximizing benefit while maintaining some sense of equity.
Thank you so much. So much to dive into there. Let's turn it over now to Alison Muotri, who is a researcher working in emerging neuroscience issues and neurobiology issues at the UC San Diego School of Medicine.
Thanks, David, for moderating this. Thanks, everyone. So I'm a faculty. I have my own lab here at UC San Diego. But today I'm talking as the director of the stem cell program here at UC SD. And stem cells is not, it goes well with controversies. And I think the first time that I remember something being controversial in this field was related to Dolly the clone, where I think the public was taken by surprise that we were able to clone an animal. So that was the first thing that I remember being quite controversial in this field. But what I think it's positive is the public perception on stem cells. It's always more towards something that will bring hope and cures for common diseases such as Alzheimer's, autism, Parkinson's. So most of the public sees stem cells as something good. And I think one example of that is the new Proposition 14 here in California, injecting $5.5 billion to CIRM, the California Institute for Regenerative Medicine. So this is like an example that the public really sees stem cells as something that would bring benefit to human health. However, I do believe that this public perception might fade quickly if we fail in communicating what we are doing. I mentioned Dolly the clone, but there are other topics that are quite hot in stem cells, and they keep coming. The use of artificial blastocyst is something that was in the news early in this year, and that shakes some of the perception in some people, especially on the religion connotation of what we are doing. Are scientists playing God? I mean, this is some kind of a common thing that I hear from time to time. The issue of chimera, mixing stem cells, human stem cells with animals. This is another thing that it's weird from the public perception. We are moving now to create, for example, brain tissues from stem cells. My own research is on brain organoids, and the idea that one of these brain organoids might reach self-consciousness or self-aware makes people uncomfortable. So they start questioning, why are you doing that? So they lose track of the purpose, of the goal that is to understand diseases and to bring treatments for that. So that's the challenge that we have on communicating the advances of stem cell biology.
Thank you so much, Alison. So much to dive into there too. And I've been reading about these brain organoids as something that, is really rife for public engagement because people are starting to hear about them. And there are so many good questions to shape the trajectory of this research. Now I'm excited to hear from Michaela Calise, who focuses on energy policy issues as a doctoral researcher in the Center for Science Media at the Public at University of Wisconsin-Madison.
Thanks so much, Blanket. Thanks to everyone. I'm a third-year PhD student in the Department of Life Sciences Communication at UW-Madison. And in addition to kind of working on research about public engagement, specifically with science from the perspective of scientists themselves is what we're doing right now. I'm also examining kind of how the public understand controversial science issues and how attitudes of the public are formed based on like their individual value systems, maybe the media use, social media use, and other factors. One of the areas that I'm focused on right now is artificial intelligence, or AI, and it's a technology that we conducted a large national survey on, and some of the questions that we have been asking with this survey data are things like, do individuals consider algorithmically curated news to be biased, and how might partisan cues influence the formation of their attitudes about this bias? What are the nuances and perceptions of risks and benefits of AI across segments of the population? Or are there racial differences or other demographic differences in awareness of AI use by law enforcement, like facial recognition technology or AI policing, or concern in AI worsening discrimination, ethical and racial discrimination? Also, as David mentioned, I have a background in energy policy, and so I'm also super interested and hope to do more work in the future regarding energy technologies, electricity, and climate change more broadly. And so some of the things that I'm interested in focusing on are kind of community energy management and energy independence, as well as technologies like small and micro nuclear, carbon capture, microgrids, solar geoengineering, kind of anything in the energy and climate space. So really excited to be here with these amazing panelists and looking forward to a really interesting conversation.
Thank you, Michaela. What a bunch of important and fascinating topics you just brought forward as a group, as a panel. I wanted to bring one logistical thing forward, which is that I see people are already correctly using the Q&A tab to submit questions that we'll get to, and we will sort of riffle through them as we go. But I want to begin by actually asking the audience a question, and would ask you to put it in the chat. I'm told that you'll be able to do that, and we'll be able to see it, and you'll be able to see each other. I'm wondering if you could kind of all share what topic and field you're working in, and if there's an example of a socio-scientific question that you think is really important to explore with the public. We won't be able to get to all of that, but I think it would be great for us to get a sense of who's out there and start a conversation. And in that vein, we talked a little earlier about sort of the importance and the relevance of finding the right question for public engagement. And I'd love to hear from each of you. I'll start with Michaela this time and Megan, about like, is there a question that you'd love to do a public engagement activity about that you haven't gotten to do yet, pertaining to one of those fields, or something that you've already done that you really have learned a lot from, and you think is important for people who are thinking about public engagement to learn from, either in terms of something that went well or something that you wish you had done differently? We've all, you know, dipped our toes into this and are learning about what this kind of authentic public engagement can build for a researcher trying to find out from the public to inform the trajectory of their work. So Michaela, please.
Awesome. So one thing that I am super excited about that I am doing right now is asking a question about what role new energy technologies play in Wisconsin communities and how they make decisions about energy management. So we got this small grant through the university, and this is led by my advisor, Dominique Broussard, and we're working with a bunch of professors across different disciplines and staff and extension folks, and we are going to be conducting a workshop, 2 workshops, with Wisconsin community representatives, decision makers, related stakeholders, researchers, and undergrad students. And we're going to kind of learn about how Wisconsin communities are thinking about new energy technologies and what that does to influence how they make decisions about energy independence. So I'm really excited about that. Some work that I'd really like to do in terms of public engagement is work that involves policy, especially with my kind of background in policy. I would love to combine what I'm doing now with that interest, and that could be local, state, or federal policy. I'd love to either have my work inform policy or work directly in the policymaking process. There are some really fantastic scholars doing stuff in this, especially in the kind of climate and energy space. Dr. Tony Reams, who's at the University of Michigan School for Environment and Sustainability. He does energy justice and sustainable systems work, but currently is the senior advisor of the Department of Energy's Office of Economic Impact and Diversity. I talked to him last summer via Zoom, and he was like so inspiring and was like, "You're doing a great job. Keep asking questions, keep talking to people." And so like that, he's definitely somebody that's been really inspiring to me. Doctors Ayanna Elizabeth Johnson and Catherine Wilkinson, if you don't know them, they edited this amazing anthology called All We Can Save about climate change. It's beautiful, inspirational. They host podcasts, and recently Dr. Ayanna Johnson testified before Congress about ocean-based climate action. And I would love to one day, when I am, more of an expert in science communication, would love to be testifying in front of Congress and doing some of that kind of very applied policy work.
Thanks so much, Michaela. Ali-san, let's go to you now. What's something that you've either sort of already done some public engagement from, that you've learned from, or something that you've always kind of been, dying to do, and this session is making you really want to go out there and do it?
Yeah, so these are great questions. I've been involved with the ISSCR, the International Stem Cell Research Society, to create a platform for public engagement, explaining all the issues with stem cells, including ethical and societal issues. So there is going to be a specific chapter with examples and even instructions for how the researcher should, kind of words you should use, things like that. So this is ongoing. In the past, what I've done, especially because I'm working with brain organoids, was to bring the issue of the ethical consideration in the use of brain organoids in science. And we did 2 public seminars here at UCSD, trying to kind of gauge the interest of people, and we asked them what are their impressions before and after the seminar, before we explained the research and after we explained the research. And it was very interesting because before it was lots of fear. I mean, they were questioning if this is really the route that research should go, if we're not crossing any ethical borders by creating those entities, if there are a moral status to these organoids, if we can use these organoids to do something bad. And also in some basic questions about how science is done. I mean, who oversees the science? So the public are not aware, how those things happen. So after we give like the talks and explanation and discussions, and then we hear from the audience, and it becomes very clear that they are all very supportive, because most people would have someone in their families who are affected by a neurological condition. So they see the value of that, even though, eventually some of these organoids might be self-aware or acquire consciousness, but that's okay. That's this. It goes in the same level as animal research. Some people don't like it, but animals are conscious, and we use them for research because we think that the benefit is greater. So this is something that we've done. I learned a lot about this public perception. Some crazy things. They were thinking that we're putting brain organoids in drones to kill somebody. It was very interesting to hear all these crazy ideas, what they think we are doing in the lab. Something for the future, also I think related to brain organoids, and I'll make an invitation to Megan here, because we are combining these 2 technologies. We are now using genome editing to alter how these neural networks behave. One example is one of our work by archaeolizing one of the genes in human brain organoids. So we replaced the modern human gene by a Neanderthal variant. And this is like to study how neurological conditions emerge during evolution. So that's a very also, controversial thing that many people from the lay audience might think, why he's doing that, why they're doing that. So in the same time that we're using CRISPRs to look into our past, we can use CRISPRs to look in our future and evolve brain organoids to be more resistant to Alzheimer's. But at the same time, they might be creating more synapses. Would that increase human intelligence. So the combination of these two technologies is something that I would be fascinated to be involved in a discussion.
Thank you so much. I have to tell a quick story. So we've all had this experience of things that we wish we could have done that got confounded by this horrible thing that we're all going through with the pandemic, and how it's created new opportunities. I love how you're sort of proposing an idea for a research collaboration right now. I have to tell you, people who don't know on the call, that the International Stem Cell Society research, the International Society for Stem Cell Research meeting that Ali-san just mentioned was supposed to happen in Boston this year. And we were working with the organizers to host a forum that we had created on human genome editing that we did at about 40 sites, I think including Michaela's institution participated as one of those sites. We were doing it for the very reason that we thought if they talked a little bit about that, help them think about this confluence of gene editing and stem cell research, and think about how they could engage the public around this emerging work. So while we weren't able to do that, we actually think that we're going to be able to do a small version of it next year, and we're excited. So who knows what will happen after this conversation. Dr. Hofstrasser, please tell us a little bit about where you'd really like to go with this public engagement, or things that have already gotten you a lot of information that is guiding your work now.
Sure. That work you just described sounds really interesting. I'd love to learn more about that. I guess I would say for the most part, a lot of my work has focused on outreach and engagement directly with people. That's kind of focused on education. So getting people up to speed, making resources to help people understand really complex topics like genome editing. And so I haven't gotten to do really in-depth, rigorous public engagement that I would publish in a journal, that kind of thing. So I would really love to get to do that kind of work at some point. I think one topic that I think is really interesting that we could think about doing some engagement on is related to what other panelists have actually alluded to in neuroscience. We are thinking at our institute about pursuing some neurological disorders and developing genome editing based therapies for them, including things like Alzheimer's. And I think I would be really intrigued to know what the public might think about some of these different options that we can take, because in some ways you could go, if we knew if there was one gene that caused Alzheimer's, we could try to just go in and fix that, right? That would be very straightforward, but that's not how this disease works. So there's potential to do clinical trials where you want to edit multiple genes at once. That's very different from anything that's really being tested right now. There's potential to edit risk genes, and that's what I'd be really interested to know what people think about. Would you ever enroll in a trial where you don't even have Alzheimer's yet? You just have potentially a genetic predisposition to developing it. Would you enroll in a trial where you undergo what is potentially kind of a risky new novel therapy to potentially prevent a disease that you don't have? And how do people perceive that risk? So especially if you're doing something like lowering risk of something developing, not even guaranteeing that it won't develop. There's so many kind of complex questions, I think, when it comes to how people perceive risk, how people perceive clinical risk, how that's influenced by their experiences with loved ones who might have the same condition, how it is influenced by their perceptions of science in general and trust within scientists and medicine. So those are the kinds of things I would really like to dive into, because I think it could be really interesting in informing our research direction. Since we're kind of at the beginning of this, should we be pursuing something that involves multiple edits? Should we be doing risk reduction and prevention? Should we only try treating people that already have the disorder? Things like that, I think, are kind of cool to think about and are a little bit more practical to think about, because it carves out one little niche thing for us to run through. I think a lot of the studies of how people perceive gene editing that have been done so far can be really broad, and it makes it a little bit hard to use those learnings to guide what you do at a practical level. But a lot of them are also extremely informative. So there needs to be work on both sides, but I would be interested in going into some of these nuanced, really nitty-gritty types of risk perception questions.
Thank you so much. And that whole idea of just like sort of the ability of researchers to co-create the questions for public engagement with the communities and publics that they're serving through their research and that they're, eventually hoping to hear from to inform the trajectory of what they're trying to find out. It's interesting to look at some of the comments that are coming in response to the question that we asked. It's a really wide array of research, pretty much everything you can imagine, but a lot of synergy with some of the gene editing and genetic work that we heard about, but also people working on environmental science and management, also some big data AI people thinking a lot about the ethics and equity of that technology and everywhere that it can go. Some really interesting discussions, but also what I wanted to call out is a lot of people talking about how they want to engage people who may be either downstream of a particular issue or may not have had a voice yet when I look at how people are thinking about doing their own public engagement, and a lot to learn from there. And that gets us a little. The next question I wanted to ask you all, I know we talked a lot about this and we were discussing it earlier as a group. What are the topics inherent to these fields of research that you have brought forward? Each of you have clearly thought a lot about, what those socioscientific questions are for you and your colleagues, but which are the ones where you think it's most essential to really focus in on those historic inequities and disparities that have systemic impacts upon how science is done and who benefits from the products of science, as we heard a lot about in the last, I thought, very, very powerful panel. And where can we think a little bit about how to consider those unintended or negative outcomes that cascade on those societal inequities? Are there things that you really think we need to address that as you think about these public engagement topics, you're like, that's one where we really need to think about these equity and access questions and these inequitable sort of societal issues. And I'll just throw it out for anybody who wants to answer that question to begin.
Sure, I'll jump in. The work that I'm doing right now is super applicable to this question. I think that this is just because these are very salient in my brain. So I'm obviously I'm like, AI has a lot of problems, or could have a lot of problems, but also could be so hugely monumental for so many industries across society. And but it has the potential to really exacerbate existing inequities that we see throughout society. And that might be because of AI policing, like we're researching right now, but also in health or in employment. And I think, what data goes into creating these algorithms really can influence the outcome of the technology and how it's applied. And if we're not thinking about those potential inequities and how they might be exacerbated on the onset of creating the technologies or apps or whatever it is, then I think that could be really problematic. So we really want to be having those conversations even before some of these technologies are, applied and being used across the public. In energy also, there's a lot of known inequities, whereas in AI, there's some known, but also a lot of potential unknown. In energy, there's so much data about how there's inequities within the energy system, whether it's electricity access and cost disparities, health issues from where power plants are located, who's involved in the decision making about energy and energy innovation. And from that, there's been this huge community that I'm really inspired by around energy justice, scholars in energy justice. We even have a DOE Office of Minority and Economic Impact led by Shalonda Baker. And these kind of folks are really centering their work around equity and justice, not as an afterthought, but as part of the design process of how we think about innovation in energy and infrastructure. And that is super inspiring to me because I think it provides this kind of framework that we could use across different issues and industries. And so I'm definitely going to be paying a lot of attention to the energy justice space and seeing how I can use my knowledge and communication and maybe steal some things from that space to apply to how we consider inequities in other science and technology innovation.
Thanks so much. Other thoughts?
I can just add that on health sciences is not that different as the new technologies appear. And I believe, with genome editing, it was going to be the same thing, gene therapy, ASOs. These are all new technology that we are developing now. Most likely will lead to a cure to some diseases. But one great example that we already have, and it's creating inequity, is the medicine for muscular atrophy, So if you give it early on, I mean, you basically cure the person one single injection, and it costs $1.5 million. Here in US, they figured out a deal with the insurance companies that would pay the cost. But outside US, that cost is it's unbelievable. I mean, people don't have access to that. So they know there is a cure for their child, but they don't have access to it. So they are relying on philanthropy or crowdfunding sources to kind of get to the medicine. So this is one thing that over time, the idea is that the cost will decrease as with any new technology. But the entrance point is always inequitable. And honestly, I mean, I think it's a great discussion, but I don't know how to solve that. This is something that we keep thinking about it, and it's hard.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think that's a huge potential inequity that we're just on the path to allowing to happen if we don't think about this a lot more deeply. Most of these genetic therapies are going to cost, minimum like $300,000, and even potentially multiple millions of dollars. I think we work a lot on sickle cell, and I think that's a case where it's very obvious that inequity could be really damaging. So with sickle cell, this is a genetic disorder that largely affects African Americans in the US, who have, of course, dealt with a horrible history of mistreatment and abuse in our health system. And so I think if we do develop a treatment for sickle cell, like our institute and many others are trying to develop, and then we say, oh, but it costs $2 million and it won't be covered by insurance and all this, you're really risking exacerbating some earned mistrust that exists there. And I think also to kind of connect back to the topic of the discussion, controversies arise when you aren't thinking about these things in advance sometimes, when you're not thinking what could go wrong, how could people become incensed by this? And so something we're trying to do engagement-wise is to do a lot of in-depth engagement with the sickle cell community, because that is a therapy that we're trying to develop, and to also think, are there other options to make this therapy available to people besides handing it off to a company that's going to charge whatever they end up charging? Are there other things we can do? Can we innovate in the drug development process and come up with ways to equitably distribute things? So maybe that means partnering with government agencies to offer treatments for a reduced cost, or keeping it somehow in the nonprofit space. I'm not sure what the answer is, but that's something we're trying to think about a lot. I think it's a really difficult question, but it's so important to consult with people and try to anticipate some of these reactions to what you're developing in advance.
Thanks so much. That's all such important stuff. And it actually, what you just talked about, Megan, gets me to the first audience question I'd like to weigh in on. There's a lot of them, but I think the first one that I'd like to connect to is this idea of who sets the agenda and how do we determine these questions. Brooke Smith is asking, based on what we heard in the third plenary yesterday, she says, we heard about how scientists set the engagement agenda, but perhaps they shouldn't, given some of these ethical issues are born from scientific discovery. What is the role of science? Do they have a responsibility then to set the agenda, but how to do that in a way that puts the public first? And I'm going to add something to that, as if it's not thorny enough already, because it's a question I'm particularly interested in. We're trying to do this and finding it hard. How do we balance the need for anticipatory input on topics that the public may not see as important because they may not have heard of them, and the opportunity for researchers such as yourself, who actually welcome in public input and want to hear about how to shape the trajectory for emerging technology, with the need to engage around issues that may be top of mind for people that, if you were just to ask them, what are their major problems that they face every day, they may not bring up. How to equitably create, a solution for this health problem, unless they see themselves impacted by it. But as you say, it brings up all sorts of other societal questions that we want input on, and it's really important. So just want to throw that out and see what you think of that very challenging question.
jump in again. One of the things that I think of when thinking about setting the agenda is whether or not, you know, the public is interested in something. As a scientist, and I'm not sure, there are lots of different types of scientists, right, in all sorts of different fields. One question I would have for Brooke and others who are wondering about this is, if you're in the hard sciences, are you including social scientists in your research? Because these are the exact kinds of questions that as a communication scientist, we're asking, and we're trying to figure out, you know, what the answer is to that. Should we be setting the agenda, or should the public set the agenda? Well, we could empirically inform that answer to that question, and I think that is what we should do more of, is have collaborations between disciplines that involve social sciences, to ask these questions and to figure out ahead of time, you know, well, where would we want to put new nuclear power? Or should we do this solar geoengineering, you know, creation of clouds above Sweden project without asking the public whether or not they will care about it? Involving social scientists and communication scientists specifically as collaborators on some of your research projects, I think would be one way to try to kind of figure out what matters to the public and how we decide to set the agenda, or what ways we should or should not, or what ways might be most effective to engage with the public on specific issues.
And I'll just add, sort of thinking about that, I think you also, it's a little bit tougher even with basic science, because a lot of times that's not going to sound super interesting to the public. If it's some really nitty-gritty study of how some mineral is processed by a microbe or something like that, it might not sound very appealing. And I don't know that we want something that doesn't sound interesting on its surface to not be funded or to not be pursued just because of that. I think CRISPR is a good example of that, right? It started as people studying some seemingly esoteric microbial defense system, but then it turned into a really useful technology. So it is kind of difficult to try to balance public input and what people might want and what might sound interesting and appealing with what might end up being really impactful when you can't totally predict that. But I guess trying to think practically on how we could potentially start setting this agenda earlier, I'm trying to think of kind of control points. So I think funders could potentially have a big influence here, where if funders can facilitate doing some public engagement, maybe forums or, you know, even deliberative polling kind of exercises with representative demographics of areas, if they could kind of figure out where the public interest is first before even putting out calls for proposals or funding different projects, that could inform scientists who are not necessarily going to be the best at figuring out what the public wants before they decide what research to pursue. So that's just one idea for how we can kind of try to move that concept, which I think is really interesting to think about and probably correct, that we shouldn't be setting the agenda and moving that into reality.
So yeah, those are all amazing thoughts and really important in thinking about how to set the research agenda and the public engagement agenda for this kind of work. There are some questions coming in, and we knew there would be, about trust in science. A lot of people are saying that while we are seeing, evidence that people say they trust science and scientific institutions, the behaviors that we see among the public, unfortunately, during this time are making people question whether we're able to have an informed conversation. And in fact, there are some people saying, well, what do you do when people start co-opting terminology and ideas that have been developed with public engagement in mind and then using it for things to attack the institution of science? I don't have an answer for that, but I guess my question for you is there anything that you have found works really well in terms of framing these questions, or how to invite participation when you do these kinds of public engagement exercises that tends to have people keep the science in the discussion while acknowledging that science can't answer these problems on its own without values and personal experience from a diverse public?
Jump in here really quick without not necessarily like tactics, but there's a bunch of really awesome research from my department and colleagues of mine specifically around this topic about trust in science and kind of how that influences people's behaviors. And we see with, COVID, even though there's high trust in science, and that's been consistent, across as long as there has been polling about trust in institutions, trust in scientists has been really high. But then in reality, we'll see certain issues where people aren't actually kind of behaving in a way that might indicate deference towards science. And one of a really great piece that I will put in the chat here in The American Scientist by some of my colleagues, one of whom is in the audience right now, Isabel Freeling, is one of the findings that they kind of talked about in this piece is that public trust in science can be undermined by communication that isn't tailored to an audience and isn't tailored to their value systems, rather than just like believing that they just trust in science and expecting them to trust science, but actually tailoring what you want them to do, tailoring the kind of outcomes that you're hoping for based around their values, whether that be political or religious or based on their age or whatever else. Another thing that can undermine communications is a failure to acknowledge the uncertainties of science or promise really simple solutions, and then those simple solutions not work. And people get really upset because you said one thing and then that changed. I think COVID was a really good example of some of these kinds of issues that came up. But I'll throw in, so that other panelists can give some examples of their own experiences. I'll throw these pieces in the chat for everyone.
And David, I would just add to what Michaela said on the language that both scientists and scientist communicators used, sometimes in an oversimplification. In my field, we always had brain organoids for several decades, but at one point someone called it a mini brain. Once you call it a mini brain, then the public perception have changed a lot. So that's one example of an oversimplification that creates a major problem that we now have to solve.
Thank you so much. So we're getting towards the end of our time. We got our 5-minute warning. And I just wanted to throw out one very last question. And if you can chime on it quickly, that would be great. And we came up with it together, right? We wanted to say, what do you think the main barrier for doing this kind of public engagement at scale might be, or effectively, because it might not be at scale, depending on what you think the right thing is. And how do we address this as a field? What would it mean to be part of a team across the scientific community and adapts that, the precepts of science communication that we've been hearing about for this conference? What's your one thing that everybody needs to remember if you could give us that advice?
I would say that you have to enjoy doing that, and I feel that there are people that don't like this kind of discussion or to be involved on that. So it has to be willing to participate and to contribute. So you have to enjoy to do that first.
I would kind of build off that something a little bit larger, is I think that this actually takes a little bit of cultural change and kind of deconstructing the hierarchy of the value of sciences and really valuing the broader range of science. And this is me as a social scientist really saying like social science is super important and we need to be valuing qualitative research as data that's just as good as some of the hard science research that is done. And one way that you could do this is by expanding your collaborations beyond your department or your field. If you're a practitioner, working with academia, if you're an academic, working outside of academia and working with different people from different disciplines to really challenge your own perspectives so that you are being challenged to think in ways that other people do. And it really gets you outside of your zone. And kind of adding on that, I think, is really supporting the people that you're working with and learning from. So the collaborators that you are working with, make sure you follow up with them and be a good collaborator and a fun researcher, making a space creative and supportive so that the work that we're doing is fun and exciting.
Absolutely. Yeah, I agree with what you guys said. I think we really need to shift the way we think about science in general and change the way we structure incentives and promotion, tenure, all of these sorts of things, training of undergraduates. funding, everything, if we really want to get an integrated system, because it's not so easy to just, email a social scientist and start a collaboration. I mean, actually that is kind of easy, but it's not necessarily something most scientists will think to do and actually pursue, because I think a lot of people are going to perceive that as a distraction, and it's not something that their university is going to value in what they're doing. They need to get papers out, they need to get tenure, all that. So I think we really need to rethink how we hire, how we promote, how we fund people, those sorts of things, if we want to get a truly integrated science, hard science plus social science collaboration structure to happen.
Thank you so much. I think those are all really good things that we need as a field and as a group. And I want to focus in, just to end, on this idea that while we want scientists out there doing public engagement, we also don't, I think at our peril, charge any individual scientist with doing it all themselves. There's both sort of the pairing with the social science community that I think is important, but also we've been hearing so much at this conference about the importance of bringing in community and local knowledge, people who really have an understanding of what's going to resonate with people and what those authentic priorities are, and how we do the difficult co-creation of informing future technology and emerging science with what's on people's mind and what's going to resonate with all of them. So I want to thank all of you. I think this was a really fascinating conversation. I hope I'll have an opportunity to work with you more, because I'm somebody who tries to figure this out and put it into practice based on the work that you're all doing out there. And I know the audience has benefited greatly from your ideas, and we've benefited from the ideas that the audience has put forward. So I want to thank everyone, and I hope this is just the beginning of a conversation, and that you'll participate in some of the breakout discussions later to build on some of these ideas. Thank you so much for your time.